I'm curious, Maxwell, Julie, Paul, for the three of you, you have, um, how can I say this? Like you've gotten a lot out of architecture, right? You know, particularly in terms of like representation. And Maxwell, I'm talking more about your artistic practice, right? Not your professional practice as an architect, but specifically like some of the drawings that I saw you do at Denniston Hill, which to me were like immediately legible, right? Like this guy, was trained in a certain, way of like looking at and representing the world. I think maybe for Miitesh, like your trajectory is a bit different in that you've worked on really like almost every major architectural project in the last like I don't know 20 years or something, right? You're like the I guess like what you get from architecture is maybe like less about representation than it is about a kind of like idea or a critique if I'm understanding
Yes.
this correctly. So
Yeah,
like
I agree. Yes.
I was just hoping maybe to like draw you guys into a conversation, maybe the three of you first, about like why is that way of perceiving the world through say like the academic plan section elevation, why is that language like important to your practice, and meaning like your non-architectural practice.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear Julie's perspective, but as much as there are problems within the profession, like I'll say this, when I was still a child in school, there was one family who'd wanted all their sons to study law because they felt as if law was an ideal profession to do anything in the world. And so for me, those skills of architecture, I think I'm immensely grateful for them because it's more like the rigor of it, right? It gives me the skills in which to interrogate and iterate constantly, right? And to find actual joy in doing that. For me, it's a lot of work, and I also feel like I wish I could be a little bit more relaxed about the process of it. But for me, that process of intense rigor, because I mean you have to, and I miss that tradition. And even if it is on a computer, gosh, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of time. Lines don't just fall down. So like if you're in an editing suite, and I mean you see the kids, they come out and they look like the Walking Dead, right? Because it's like it's intense process of just continually looking at something and continually changing it until that line is the weight that you want. So I will always be grateful for that, right? Because I can take that anywhere and just run with it. Well, there goes the Pepsi. But yeah, I mean, I like that. I mean, and some of the people. So yeah.
Paul?
Yeah, me. Well, like my kind of entry into the conversation about architecture comes through like sort of innocently being interested in like a sense of the kind of historical weight of certain kind of classical tropes. And once I started reading it, it just reinforced and really expanded the sense that what architecture represents is a kind of shared, almost psychic space that could be entered in through a kind of seemingly like simple surface level of an image. Like the ground plan of the church actually is an extremely layered thing, and has a political dimension, a sociological dimension, like a bodily dimension, a cosmological dimension, and everything is sort of like all these ideas are layered into like what seems on the surface like a very simple image. So,
I just wanted to make a historical correction. In fact, Paul, I feel like your interest in architectural drawing is an interest in modern architectural drawing. That even when you've reproduced plans from, say, Villapongo, that's the early modern looking back at the classical, right? So that like, it's not like you're like taking like, you know, like the Greek temple itself, right?
right.
Yeah, the ways that early modern
That's true.
we're looking at that.
Yeah, it was really also like the story. I mean, I specifically came through like a book that I almost like arbitrarily picked up, which
Me
is probably
too.
really, yeah, like it was
Yeah, that's
art
how
in
I
the
came
age
to
of,
it.
I mean, architecture in the age of enlightenment, I think it was. Um, I forget the author, but it's like a relatively old kind of, uh, you know, like treatise on architecture.
Is it like a Diderot, a Diderot and D'Alembert kind of book with a lot of etchings?
It definitely had reproductions from like, you know, like um, throughout history. And the point was that
Yeah.
it really like it drew a connection to, I think what you're talking about in terms of the like the projection of these ancient ideas through successive kind of historical moments as
Well,
like images of power, but like constantly being like retranslated across, you know, like geographically from, you know, through Europe and to England and then to like the New World. But just this sense of like, holy shit, like, you know, there's a reason why you see the same kind of like shapes and also kind of like decorative details leading right up to like, you know, the present and into modernity even. Like there's, in a way, there's this clear line of continuity from at least the projection of like an ancient past of like, you know, Western foundations of civilization, like right up into the present power structures.
Yeah.
I also wanted to amplify this idea that it's not just, you know, a projection, but it's in fact a misunderstanding that, you know, this is, you know, every Renaissance scholar of Vitruvius like gets something wrong, right? You know, famously Palladio, who like looks at Vitruvius and like can't figure out this word and just interprets it as saying, you know, Vitruvius saying, the Greeks, who are also removed from Vitruvius's own time, lived in temples, you know, and so Palladio understands that to be like, okay, well, I'm going to put like this Greek temple front on all of my villas, and
Right.
gets
Yeah.
embedded into the language so that
Yeah.
with a Home Depot, right?
Same thing.
Like,
Well, but then, you know, like you guys are talking about, you know, the problems with the, say, like with the academic structure reproducing itself and unable to get beyond, you know, a certain traditional like limitation into the area where the action really is. And so to me, in a way, like I can't help but think that what what it's describing is somehow, you know, the way things gel into an image and how that image then becomes like a limitation that becomes like extremely difficult to get beyond. Uh, you know, the difference between like say the practice and the discovery versus like how it gels into an image and our reliance on the image in a way, like, you know, if the point in architecture, as I sense that it is like I mean, what interests me in Miitesh and Maxwell in your practice is you seem like consciously wanting to resist this kind of like the closure of the academic environment in favor of like an opening into the world and a kind of like discovery that can be found there. And yet, you know, it seems like that to then, but to actually do that is really fraught, because in a sense, like there's a question of like, are you just imposing the image on the real world even further? Like, is this another act of colonialism? You know?
Gosh, that's scary. I mean, I'll let Julie answer before I get into that.
Well, I mean, I think we should move really freely. I feel like I came into architectural like that kind of like looking at it very innocently as well. And for me, it was actually, it was kind of like working backwards. Like I was working with like trying to make sense of things and tracing things and trying to build that story that Paul describes, actually reading in that book. I came to that book much later, but that was after I was already trying to actually create those layers going back as far. So I was actually trying to use photographs of those amphitheaters in Greece or wherever, and to create this kind of, you know, art structure in the paintings where these drawings were layered one on top of another. And if I was working with a photograph, how do I translate that photograph into a drawing? And in that, it was just kind of trying to mine that language to use it as somewhat of a metaphoric space for time, and a way to kind of visualize collapsing time and space. But it was, in the end, in many ways, that became what they would do, what the drawings would do when they became so layered is there was this other kind of dizzying, maybe disorienting spatial dynamic that I became more interested in. And I think ultimately I left the architectural language behind because of, in essence, it was a limiting kind of space. It offered a certain type of conceptual grid and parameter to like for the drawing and for what could be possible. But then it was also a very particular spatial limit in terms of what, just even with scale, which is so fundamental to like the idea, to not even thinking conceptually. And so I think that's one of the reasons I ended up moving away from it. But I worked with that language for years and years before. And I think it was through the investigation of that language that I was able to kind of try and understand my interest in geography, in space, and then in historic time. But it was always about, for me, the bigger, like when you said, Lawrence, about this early on about kind of architecture comes from this kind of cohesive study of astrology, cosmology, and, you know, carpentry and masonry, as well as a geology, and it's used for space. And I think that, to me, like it was like the use of that language was about trying to, and playing with those mistellings of time, and especially kind of trying to think about decolonial space in some way. And how do you do that when the vision of space is so kind of dominant, and particular colonial narratives are so dominant in architectural imaging or in architectural.
I really wanted to talk about this. Has really been like a bug up my ass, like particularly this morning, is like, you know, about the possibility of decolonization, which finally made its way as a metaphor, a metonym, into like architectural discourse, right? Well, this is really the problem.
Right.
We must decolonize architecture, which is just like another, you know, like
trope.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, you know, another like empty, like shallow gesture versus like creating equity, or any of the buzzwords that our profession, our discipline, it really excels at. You know, we must admit, we make great drawings, and
it's the best.
Generating like, you know, empty, you know, concepts. Like, so I wonder, to ask the five of us, like here, as you know, the children of a much longer historical process, you know, the process of colonization, whether like in fact like this is something that's even possible, can be extended to architecture. Certainly, like, you know, the idea of decolonization is, you know, it is material. It has to do with space, right? It has to do with a particular way of understanding space. And I'm wondering whether like that way of understanding space, right, that is so necessary for decolonization, there's not room for it within architecture, right? There is a worldview that does not understand space as limited, modifiable, as real estate, as developable.
I mean,
No, But I think what Paul brought up earlier, what you were saying about the image, Paul, what you were
Yeah.
saying just before, I think that's completely related to this gesture or this space that Lawrence is talking about, like where it goes outside of the actual, outside of architecture, and it becomes about how you kind of rethink that image, or
Right.
what is an image, or what, how that can be imposed on that.
Can I just offer, like, I just wanted to give 2 quick examples. Just, I couldn't help but take the opportunity to like look at you guys' websites a bit and just generally like think about the kind of how I relate to your practices. And, like I kind of fixated for a second on the project Miitesh, like there's a publication, it has to do with, I think it's called Between Mythology and Utopia.
Yeah, I did too.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
And then on the other hand, like with Maxwell, like this idea of like informal economies, like both of these, there's an idea of like kind of interrogating the relationship of like self and other in like the exchange, where like in the architectural exchange or in the design exchange, or in the critical exchange, like in Between Mythology and Utopia, there's this kind of like particular reading of Heidegger, and this, about ways of being in the world, and specifically like, like the introduction of this idea that to be in the world is not about like yourself separate from the world, but can be thought of as like something much more continuous and immersive, maybe, where it's not so clear like where that boundary really lies between self and other. And I really, there's an association for me of other and image to bring what you're saying, Julie, into it. And so to like in some ways like let go of a certain control via like seeing the world or the or the other as an image, and I don't know, just like interrogating that relationship leads, like the suggestion is that you get then into something that where you just start to become more quiet and observational, like this idea that like in the informal economy studies that you're doing, Maxwell, that like part of what that's about is like not immediately seeking to be the author of the solution, but actually observing solutions that already exist and that you could actually learn from as a critical mind or as an architectural mind. And similarly with Between Mythology and Utopia.
I mean, for me, I will confess that the image is beguiling, right? Yes. I didn't get here because, I like door schedules. It's because, there's something about that image that that draws you in, and that you can get lost in it and you can stay there. And I had a professor who used to say, like, stop knitting, like just leave that drawing alone and move on. But you're sort of hypnotized, right? To stay within that space, right? And so even when, I've tried to go into these spaces to take the authorship and the drawing out of it, to say, the architecture exists without it. It's hard, right? To let go and to unlearn all those kind of security kind of, just there's points where I it's not comfort, I don't know what it is, but it really is, it's like the siren song, right? And so it's like allowing yourself to let it go, and also realizing that we are living in, what is it, this imaginative geography, right? That someone had said that this is what architecture should be, and it's very much part of this colonial agenda, right? And that became policy, that became legislation, that became what it meant to have a door and at what height, etc. And it's sort of saying, well, what is it to let that go, right? What is another way? So I have friends who who did a school in Uganda, and they're like, we don't need glazing. There's just no need for glazing here, no matter what the book says. So let it go. So it's that idea of just letting go of this.
Well,
It turned
yeah,
idea.
I think like exactly one thing I've always tried to do is, especially with teaching, is like sort of in a very Heideggerian sense, like eliminate certain words because they're historically have baggage. So don't use the word window. You think about transparency, opacity, think about porosity. So use non-architectural terms to describe maybe a spatial interaction. And I think one of the things I always try to do is the delegitimization of self with my students in my own work. Like, it's a fundamental critique of your own self, teach doubt. And I think once you begin teaching doubt, you see this interconnectedness. So a lot of what I do with students is sort of use the tools of architecture as a journalist, begin to sort of document and map, but then go back and critique it, because also data is deeply subjective and deeply flawed. So how do you have this combination of, so one class I do is I teach them, as I'm teaching them some technique like GIS or Python, we're reading literature to discredit that, right?
That's
so
amazing.
And so, because I do believe you should learn how to be precise, but then also understand precision as an imposition, right? It's a false construct, but somehow it's better to critique the precision if you can be precise.
Right.
So I think it comes back, most of my architecture, the way I practice architecture, the way I teach architecture has been really more informed from the fact that I studied philosophy and political science in grad school and undergrad, and then working in this sort of realm, and then, I also discovered architecture through a book as well. I was in grad school for philosophy and I saw SMLXL by Rem, and I'm like, this dude's figured it out. He's like architecture you can do everything with this profession, right? And you can kind of do a lot because you're not an expert, so you can actually be kind of bad at it too and still do it. And so I went to architecture school to work for him, and so I think what we're saying is that, I've never thought about the image as much as I did since I've been back in the United States, or the representation. I've always seen it as, Lauren said about critique and thinking, but I've never actually saw the image other than as a method or a mechanism to get to an idea, right? I know that's not true, and maybe it was my lack of sort of critiquing the image, but what I liked about architectural language is that I could go to any country, and now I realize this is also part of colonization, is that it can translate, and maybe that's not a good thing. I used to think that was a good thing, right? So I think how this profession can go forward is that, because I think there's a lot of beautiful things within it, and teaching it, yes, but then teaching it through critique and delegitimizing the certainty in it, so we can use it. But as we use it, we also understand it's simply just one perspective, and there's infinite ways to understand these things. So that's, I guess, I don't know that offers anything, but I think it's important that we as a profession eliminate this certainty, right? And that's why we shouldn't have experts. We shouldn't have any of these things that define a dominant perspective or a dominant gaze. If that's clear.
That's
But
great.
if you're also saying that in a way to question the role of being of expertness, or of the expert, is not opposed to also achieving a kind of precision or expert ability. Like, it's kind of like a double, it's a two-step process. You learn how to do it, and then you question it too.
Right, yeah, and so you teach someone, so actually in this one class, it's an introduction to critical photography, so we make very precise maps, urban systems, but then begin to intuitively work, like they have 24 hours to take this data and then layer it in ways you otherwise would not. And sort of this sort of Baconian model of data organization to discover patterns. And then taking that and try to then intuitively represent it in a way you don't know, right? The goal of the assignment is that it breaks or collapses or it doesn't work, right? That failure is an essential part of this process, right? Because we've taught students not to fail. And I think in geography and all these things, I think the reason a lot of people are in geography right now is because it's so vague and it's so multidisciplinary and in a beautiful way. So when I was talking to others, so Neil Brenner, who's now at the University of Chicago, and he's like, geography is the best because one, it's multidisciplinary and they're theory friendly, right?
Huh.
So
Right.
and so I think, I don't know, again, so this is really coming from my position of, say, having this sort of background in theory and philosophy, and working really for a while in the profession and really getting caught up in it in a way. Like, I was really proud of what I've done, but I also didn't have that critical distance to critique it. Like, you know, like, we thought we were doing great projects, were maybe formally great, but at the end of the day, they were just much better, colonization with better taste, right? And so, but I think, I do believe that, like we were always talking about the tools and representations. I do believe in these mechanisms, but also just to teach them as the non-absolutes. You know, a plan is simply a plan because someone chosen that plan, like you were saying, Maxwell, but not because it's objective and it's what it's doing. It's not. It's bias. It has bias. You know, why is it 3.5 feet? Why is it 1.1 meters? You know, why is the handrail? And then, so one thing I think, the ideology of a detail, like, why does a door open out in some cultures as opposed to opening in? And it goes back to the idea of public space and who owns it, right? Why are the gutters on the exterior of a building as opposed to the interior of the cavity wall in certain ideas? So these things are actually deeply rooted in politics and ideology and sort of the idea of, you know, space. Because, you know, we still have to keep water out of a building, right? If you want to practice. And so, but understanding what does that really mean in terms of the realm of the individual within the collective? Like, why do Americans have their shit pipes on the exterior of a facade? That's disgusting. Like, you're putting your poop in public space, literally. Like, that to me is problematic and really indicative of the country we live in right now.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's an interesting country. Look, we're all an interesting.
I mean, what you're saying makes me also think, you know, well, this idea of, like, I don't know, like setting up one system and then destroying it by subjecting it to another criteria, like, makes me think of your paintings, Julie, and like the role of kind of, like, you know, layering different codes on top of each other to see what, you know, what they do. But then it also makes me think, like, what you're saying about geography, like, one of the things that I liked about the description of between mythology and utopia is that, like, in a sense, to, like, study geography in the context of, like, the messiness of the kind of, you know, installation of, like, national boundaries immediately calls into question, like, our kind of, like, uncritical acceptance of national boundaries or, like, national identity, you know? It's so obvious if you just start to, like, study geography, like, you know, we have these images of nations, and, like, literally, like, in the US, like, people's obsession with the American flag and not desecrating it is, like, shows you how deeply tied it is to, like, people's most fundamental sense of who they are. But then, you know, to, like, study from a geographic perspective would just immediately explode that shit.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Paul. You know, I was just thinking, like, in many ways, you know, that discourse about national boundaries and sovereignty, you know, seems almost like from a bygone era, right? This idea that actually those tools of representation, right, in some, you know, boardroom somewhere, probably in Europe, where, like, you know, the national boundaries of the post colony were, you know, were made. We're going to use this line weight to determine the national boundary, and then this lighter line weight here to determine, like, the administrative districts within the nation state, and then, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But like that kind of spatial discourse, I wonder whether that is not evaporating from, you know, a kind of attachment to the nation state, whether, like, this attachment is now actually, you know, purely in the realm of images, right?
Yes, totally.
Even symbolic, right? That the way that we sort of, like, you know, we get our news through, like, a kind of, like, you know, feed, a disaggregated feed. It's like a kind of, like, narrative stream on our phone, and then, you know, there's a video that interests us, we click on it, we try and figure out, like, what language are they speaking, where is this happening, is this next door, is this, like, you know, part of, like, this national community or another national community. That seems to me like a different question. Like that's no longer a kind of like spatial question, or maybe it's about like, you know, thinking of space in a different way.
The Hall of Mirrors.
Well, yeah, Hall of Mirrors, and I would also say like it has to do with speed. Like, you know, to me, like the practices of like cartography are relatively slow compared to like the pace of knowledge production through social media. And what we're talking about is the emergence of the primacy of social media as like the almost like singular mode of knowledge production. And you just simply could not keep up with what's happening in what appears to be happening if you're not locked into the news cycle. Like I have to say, like in the past 3 months, like I never watched CNN or any other channel the way I felt like I was forced to, like once COVID became a thing. Like, you know, there was this fear of like not knowing what was going on unless like the news cycle was on in the background almost like 24/7. But like I think back to even like as early as January, I never was tuned into like these channels the way that suddenly for like 3 months it's just been solid. And I think it's not just me, like everybody's been in it.
Yeah.
It's
And
insane.
part of the reaction to George Floyd wasn't just and that incident wasn't just that the way it exploded on social media and that everyone was paying attention, but there was nothing else to distract people. There was no basketball games. There was no finals taking place, which normally happened. There was no March Madness.
Right.
None of that normally happens, where you see those images getting dispersed, but there was no other distraction to take away from the what could happen in that time. And I hadn't thought about that before in that way, where it became so clear that because you had these cities, these small little cities all over this country where you hardly have any Black people, where the majority vote are Republican voters. And you have these kids in the street marching Black Lives Matter in these remote places. And you just think like, how did that all come together at this moment? I mean, I knew about the whole COVID side of it, but there was nothing else.
There was nothing
like
else
outside of those. Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah, that's kind of intense. That's just in terms of that image, or
like the reality is like the news, the people, like, you know, the kind of the news cycle industry has gotten a huge boost over the past 3 months.
Sure, but I mean, as an outsider, this is how I see the election of Trump. It was really just a capitalist objective to say, God, we really need this man. Otherwise, we're going to have 4 years with nothing to talk about. You know,
wow. Yeah.
4 years with no comedy to create, right? So
right.
it really, I mean, there's just so many people tied into his existence in that space, right? Even if it is just to object and oppose him, like that's creating a lot of content, you know, that's giving the Times more subscribers, that's giving CNN more content, right? That's giving Trevor Noah the best welcome to the US that he could have ever asked for.
Totally.
So I mean, and I don't know. I'm not here to critique them, but like and I think it is just this need. I mean, we're living. It's like when a horror movie, a zombie movie, where capitalism or like these especially like within a racial and colonial context refuses to die. Right? It just keeps coming back up. It's like, you know, it's a reboot. Like. The sequel's coming, just be ready for it, right? So as much as you're saying, Laura, that, you know, the nation state maybe is being dissolved, right? There is still this group that profit from it, right? That are fighting that sort of natural disaggregation of Western Christendom, etc., right?
Right.
So
I do think, yeah, maybe the nation state's being dissolved, but then there's different sort of boundaries and edges that are falsely sort of constructed. Like the idea of city versus rural is this, you know, this is simply a nonsense sort of understanding of how space and sort of production works, etc. So it's maybe the nation state sort of reinforced maybe to sort of build up sort of biases or races or sort of ideas, but there's so many other sort of different, like, you know, look at the way COVID's being sort of turned into a sport in America. Like the daily tracking of it is like watching a Bulls game, you know, like this county's up by 18 points today, right? But then like that fact that one county is worse than the next county, and it's a construct, right? It's this line. And it creates this idea of like, okay, you can't come into here. So I do think in general, the concept of nation state is being dissolved primarily through a market economy and globalization and all these things. But we're finding other ways of drawing these distinctions that reinforce the other. Right. And I think this is also problematic with an architecture that somehow you have a site. Even the idea of a site to me is absurd, as if you're not responsible for anything outside that the parameters of a property line that's simply been demarcated by a bank. Right. So it's, I think in a way it's disguising the fact that there's so many more new lines now. Maybe they've always been there, right? Chicago, the city is in 3 different states. So why is Chicago part of Illinois? It's in Indiana, it's in Wisconsin, it's in Illinois, right? So, you know, majority of, so there's, I mean, this is what's kind of nice about, if you look at sort of critical cartography and data, and then to expose these things like Chicago, you know, its expansion route is based on old Native American routes, right? And if you just turn off like 2 lines in a map, Chicago is actually 7.5 million people, but they drew a fake line around there to sort of avoid property taxes, right? So there's something deeply ideological in these lines, and I think unfortunately they're not being dissolved at this urban scale, and they're now creating this blue-red divide. And then people in these cities say, we're paying all the taxes in this country. This might be true, but it's also not very good for democracy to create that distinction through another sort of arbitrary geographical line, right? You know, it's like India and Pakistan. Like that border was created in 6 weeks. These lines are nonsense, right?
Well, you know what?
Or they're nonsense in a particular way, but they're also been really, as you know, crucial in terms of redlining and making certain kinds of aspects of any form of mobility kind of impossible for particular people based on being excluded or corralled by those lines. And one other thing about the like neoliberal ideas of this illicit economy, or these ones who you think about like that Trump is a part of alongside Putin and everyone else who's part of this like grander international illicit economic project of like massive kind of neoliberal project, like, you know, endeavor. It's to actually use these boundaries that we've previously had, or these things to actually benefit and steal from everybody else. So I just feel like, I don't know, in a certain sense, all of that, all of those things consume one another. And I think what Paul brings up about the image and kind of living in this hall of mirrors, and what Lawrence is talking about kind of the breakdown of those in a kind of lived reality that we all participate in, or those who participate with social media participate in, and this happens on a very different level. It happens in the same way and it happens with these people, with everybody not even having a geographic sense of where they are. So many, I think, I forgot the number of Americans that cannot place the United States on a global map, or on the globe.
Right.
They don't know what their neighboring countries in. They barely the continent that they're on. So when you have a situation like that, or the same thing with Australia, like but it's really strong more in the United States. And when you have a situation like that, where then you're also participating on these international Zoom calls, and you're, you know, social media with followers from all over the world, and however it works, you do have a very different understanding of your lived experience and what happens. But I think there's also something that I just want to bring up about architecture and its physical kind of manifestation in space and in experience. And what is it like? I'm going back to something very classical in a way, but what happens when you experience a painting in space, and when you experience something that goes out of the ideological, but out of the theoretical, but it's actually the visceral experience that is somewhat transformative. And this happens in architecture. It happens in space, right? And it can be as beguiling as but it's also can be massively transformative. And I'm interested in in also the concrete reality of that, and how is that something that spirited kind of endeavor which I feel like Lawrence kind of suggested or nodded towards at the beginning when you talked about architecture being this very expansive project. Like, where is that? How is that responding or can respond to moments like this or this?
Well, one thing quickly, maybe, I think understanding the distinction between space and place is very important. That you may construct these three-dimensional spaces that do certain things, but place is sort of been informed or
right.
described or experienced, and it's maybe more individual. So understanding architecture's limitation, that we can maybe create or sort of allow or enable space, but we can't create place, right? Architects can't design a space for protest. That's absurd. It undermines the whole point of protest, right? Students always want to make a wall for graffiti. I'm like, oh, okay, so you don't understand what graffiti is, right?
Yeah.
So I think, again, so spatially to me is understanding that our role is maybe to enable certain activities, but we can't define it, we can't prescribe it, and allowing for, I think, mutations, right? So most architecture is static, it's a straitjacket. So how do you actually allow for a building to be interpreted? Or, and sometimes, I mean, it's kind of like what Rem talks about in the generic plan in Delirious, New York, right? About the structure, the rigidity of it allows for infinite interpretation, right? Because it's so rigid. This rigidness allows for this. Well, and then another critique is that if a building does everything, it does nothing, right? So it's understanding the limitations and not being too specific, and understanding that hopefully you can develop a space that can be interpreted in different types of places for different people, whatever that material reality might be at that moment, right? And this sort of like what will be needed at that moment. Like, so I had a professor take me to Barcelona and show me a water tower that was turned into a library, a restaurant that was turned into a music venue, and just showing that like we don't need to tell what spaces need to be. We simply have to take advantage of the light, think about porosity, think about, quality of spaces in terms of, how much, so these sort of things I think is important, and really understanding the limitations of what we can do socially, or what we shouldn't prescribe meaning into the space.
Right.
Yeah.
But then what about like a building like the Parliament building? I'll bring it up because I just saw it in Dhaka and was blown away by it. And it's a building I've studied and known about forever,
Shari Bangla Nagar, the Parliament building.
Yeah.
By Khan.
Yeah.
So actually, that's an interesting case, right? Because Louis Kahn is notoriously like, embraces this sort of like, spiritual approach like to architecture that's really kind of like not consistent with, his modernist peers, right? He's like, ask the arch what the arch want, ask the brick what the brick wants to be, and like the materials will tell you what they want to do. And in many ways, like that, this is an architect who's like really, more than any other modernist, is very self-consciously trying to appropriate like the lessons of the classical past. And I was thinking, when we're talking about the violence of the line, and the expectation, like the line is somehow like, really like ideology that then becomes like, real, right? It's that part of ideology that is like, becomes lived experience.
Right.
Think of like what is that? Like what?
That's nicely said. I like that.
Modernist faith in like the line being translated into reality, or like the plan becoming, the building, the representation of the thing becoming the thing itself. And if we look at like classical, or ancient, and I'm talking like, things that maybe even predate Vitruvius, right? That endeavor, that architectural endeavor, like, first of all, is not the product of one genius, right? It's, it's a collaborative project, not even the project of, things that, skill sets that we associate with modern architecture, right? Not just masonry, carpentry, whatever, but also, like astrology, mathematics, agriculture, right? This is all about articulating a particular cosmological relationship of man, like, to the soil, essentially, right? If we think of, like, this is where it all begins, right? That kind of, like, that or moment, right? That has to do with, like, how is life sustained, and then how is it that life is sustained in this one place, right?
Yeah.
That to me, like, I think, like, Khan's, like, parliament building is sort of like an attempt to recover, like, a lot of that. And I don't think, like, Khan is working from that, like, perspective of, like, what is, like, what is like the parliamentarian gonna feel when he walks into this big open space, want to feel awe, that he's still working at this, like, really symbolic level, right? But it's about, like, that representation, or that, understanding that scale of, like, the human to the planet. Yeah.
And that experiential, and that as an experiential, cinematic kind of experiential thing, like, that's the feeling of that, the way that one experiences that building. It's every movement through it becomes part of this, like, unfolding of this narrative, but not just narrative, perspective. And this kind of, I don't know, it just reminds me of almost experiencing a film or something like that. You move through this space,
Well, it's like
and
immersive
it
in a way.
transforms constantly. Totally. And I think its hand-built nature contributes to that somehow too. The fact that, and I mean, for me, I haven't experienced a building like that outside of the Pantheon, like, in that way. That blew me away, the way that building did. The way that I feel when I go inside the Pantheon and look up every time, and I do think there's something about that is something that what you're talking about, Lawrence, it's so fundamental in a way to a particular kind of experience of the world, but there's something transformative in that is, like, worth, like, insisting on or talking about or interrogating,
But is there like an abstraction? I mean, like, for me, I can recall, like, sitting with a CD of Encarta Encyclopedia in 1995, right? And going through the architecture, and then all of these buildings being, like, in the abstract. So when you speak to, like, an artwork, right? So, I mean, a lot of the art that, one can consume from this part of the world is an abstraction, much less so now, but still, right? And so it's hard for me, because it's like, am I bringing that with me? Like, am I presupposing an experience into, like, a lauded space or a well-known artwork? But I think, to Mitesh's point, like, there's this distinct difference between space and place. Like, I always used to worry that I was being redundant writing the two, right? Because you're like, well, what are they going to say? What are they going to think? But it really does exist, and I agree, it can happen, right? But it's hard for me to separate, say, certain buildings and certain artworks with my presupposed idea of them to, like, just a lived reality of them, which exists, as you're saying. But yeah, so
Could I ask you, Maxwell? I mean, just because it's the most obvious example to me of, like, in a way, like the global presence of a certain aesthetic, coming from Africa, David Ajayi. Like, what do you think about, like, the role of place in his aesthetic, especially when, as you're pointing out, like, it gets sort of imported into other contexts or becomes like a brand in itself?
No, but I mean, like, he exists in the abstract for me, though, right? As well. I think I've only ever managed to experience one building of his in Whitechapel, the ideas city center. And then seeing one of the houses he did, I think for Sue Webster, right? The blackened house. But I mean, yeah, I mean, a lot of his work is just, it's on the page, it's on the screen. And yeah, it's hard for me because, yeah, I've never had that experience beyond the sort of the abstract or the theoretical or just the sort of the voyeuristic.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, Mitesh talked about this in relation to his earlier work to say, you know, it's just, what was the exact word you used about the type of colonization that you made, Mitesh, if you're still there?
Universal, talking about representation, or I can't remember. I'm sure it was.
I mean, I think in relation to like the OMA stuff, like it's.
Oh, right,
it's,
right.
It has. Pardon?
Yeah, it was just colonization with better taste.
Exactly, right?
Which is not nothing.
It's not nothing at all. Exactly. I mean, it's a significant battle. So yeah, I think yeah. I mean, like anyone. I mean, there's so many. I think the early architects who I can speak to, like, you know, living with are the Brits, right? The Fosters or the Rogers, because, you know, they built London around me, right? And so there wasn't any kind of any, anything presupposed about that work, because, you know, I could walk to the British Museum from my school and have lunch in the quad, right? And or certain buildings around the city that they had done, or in Europe, you know, in spite of having known Pompidou, it doesn't have anything with it for me. It doesn't. It's not sacred. Whereas, yeah, I mean, Ajay is it's a little bit sacred in a way. It's weird. I really want to go to Washington, right? For one thing,
You
right?
should. It's great. Have you been, Paul?
I just
Or
the
Miitesh or
outside.
Lawrence?
I can get inside.
Yeah. So you see, it's a. So I think it'll be years, at least 5 to 10 years before I see that building, right? And so much would have accrued, right, in my mind about that space and about that experience that I can't take that away from eventually going there. So yeah, it's hard.
I understand what you're saying, because I do that with, like, trying to experience paintings. There are paintings I travel to go see, and there's nothing like experiencing the painting in real life. Or Lawrence and I spoke about this with the caves in Magao in China, these ancient Buddhist, like, rock-hewn caves, or some of the photos you've sent me of temples you've visited, Lawrence, that seem mind-blowing. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because I see a lot of shit architecture constantly being made, and in terms of physical space outside of theoretical space, we're living in a shitstorm of like really crappy shit. And I feel like part of that is coming from this kind of constant dematerialized kind of ideation around, like, certain ways of thinking around this practice, and as if there isn't an actual need for this practice to manifest actually something that we have to live and be inside. And it then becomes co-opted as part of this kind of the prison kind of abusive system that we and contributes to the kind of further abuse that we have to live in these cities that we do choose to live in when we live in cities. And I think London is just as assaulting as New York in that way.
No, it is.
And
yeah.
I think
also now.
New York is especially so. Yeah. And so I do think that it might sound so traditionalist of me, but I think it's absolutely essential to actually really challenge what can be made and what can be possible, where we do have to live. There is this colonial, there is all this infrastructure that is massively problematic, but has to actually be able to be addressed with people who can draw and imagine and kind of invent like something else. And I don't know who's doing that. And I'm bringing that up to you both and to you three, actually, Lawrence, also in that profession, who, you know, are working where there is the, you know, in geography, there's this study of space, and there is this, if that's an interest, it's a very different theoretical space, but there's also a very applied necessary role in that as well, to make sense of these places, to further for other kinds of academic study. But for architecture, it's not just that. It is this lived environment that I feel has just become more and more assaultive and more
I mean, I think like what you do for paintings, I know I do for buildings, right? Like I'm, you know, like
Right.
architects travel the world to see buildings. I think for that reason, in a way,
Sure.
as well. I don't think it's just the fact that it's lived on the page. It's that you know,
Right.
what does it actually mean to like experience that space, right? I mean, you know,
Right.
I find I used to spend a lot of money just doing that, because it is kind of rare and rarefied. And obviously, you know, architecture is a service, so then there's a lot that comes with it, right?
Yeah.
And for me, oddly, I think it succeeds within the excess of capitalism, right? So when people just have way too much money not to care, then, you know, people can do other things. But then also within the limits of it, I think like there's some amazing architects in the UK who are doing great social housing, right? Who manage to find
Right.
within the limitations um, something, you know, something liminal, but also just something sacred. So it's really weird for me because on those extremes, you're more likely to find it, right? Whereas within just the middle of everything is the assault, I think, that you speak of. So it's very
Can you
strange
give
for
an
me.
example, Maxwell, of what you're talking about in terms of social housing? Like good
Okay, I don't
example.
remember the name. So I was in the UK in December, and I was in Norwich because I have a friend who lives there, and so there's housing there that had just won the Sterling Prize, which is the big architecture prize in the UK. Forget the
I
name of
think
the
it's like
housing.
Crusoe St. John, isn't it? The project.
No, I don't think
Oh,
so. I don't
okay.
remember. But I mean, I had seen the
It's those.
video. The
Is it
Sterling,
those guys that won the Turner Prize a couple of years ago?
no,
That
no.
collective.
Assemble. They're
Yeah.
interesting because I mean they speak to this sort of co-production.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and they I mean, although not so much now because one of them went to Harvard to do the Loeb Fellowship, and that was a very individualistic endeavor. But so it was Norwich had Sainsbury's Center, which was this huge sort of like airplane hangar that Foster did way back when.
Yeah.
Which I have to be honest with you, it is like walking through Star Wars. There is something kind of nice about it. You know, like everything is a detail. Like those toilets, you can never find them anywhere else. You know, so it was seeing that juxtaposed with the social housing, and I was a little in trepidation about the housing because they made such a big deal about the letterboxes not being indoors and how that reduced the cold bridges. And I'm like, letterboxes not indoors? What's wrong with you people? Like, you know, the whole post colony has letterboxes and walls. Calm down. But there is something about the space, you know. so, so just the two. It was really weird for me because the two opposites were amazing, and they have these sort of ziggurat student housings at the, I think it's UAV. UEA, University of East Anglia. And yeah, it's so interesting that, you know, that these spaces exist. And then, you know, the rest of the town is just an English town with nothing to write about, you know, drive through McDonald's and the rest. But yeah, it was lovely. Yeah. But
I mean,
I'd recommend,
sorry.
you know, no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I don't mean to be a stick in the mud, but like in some ways, you know, I don't know, like I also don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but like there's certain distinctions, like the distinction between like space and place, or you know, the distinction between like sort of trash culture and something, I don't know, just more of a higher or deeper level sensorially and kind of experientially, like, you know, like seeing the temples, or just, you know, or just being outdoors.
I mean, you're talking about
Or the
experiencing
airport, or
architecture.
the airport in China. Sorry, go ahead, Mitesh.
No, I'm sorry. So you're talking about like our own experience with architecture. Is that what you're asking? Like
Well,
buildings or objects? Or...
I guess I'm just
No.
interested in the distinction itself, and I just wanted to make sure, like, I just wanted to propose that, you know, like a caution to not impose a kind of, like, you know, qualitative hierarchy to these things. Like, you know, to me, like one difference between space and place is that place, in some ways, to me, like conjures a sense of like an investment on the level of memory,
Right.
that isn't imposed by the architect, but that's actually brought by, you know, the person who just brings the entirety of their experience, and
Right.
and projects it and personalizes the world, and in a sense, you know, so in a sense, like there could be an association between, like, you know, like a hierarchical, like, valuing of place as like a higher level of experience to be sought after. And all I want to say is that, like, that is also not, you know, like separate from, like, you know, the from the workings of ideology, and that there is a certain kind of, yeah, like, in a sense, there, you know, like in like Miitesh, in your specifically, like, I really got to thinking about it in terms of like the way that you picked up on Heidegger in that particular study. It made me think that one thing that is particular about architecture is that, you know, the looseness of what architecture is has to do with how it begins to suggest just like all experience could be, in a sense, like fabricated or framed by the architect or by someone if they wanted to put their mind to it, and that there, you know, we could see that as like benign, but there's also like a really disturbing aspect to that. Like that also represents like an even more deep potential for colonization, like on the level of memory, on the level of experience, that we take to be totally of our agency and of our kind of like inalienable experience. And yet what the suggestion is, like, it's a two-way street, and we're talking about the opening up into even greater levels of control of everything that we think of as being our most subjective and human dimensions.
Yeah, I mean,
Even cellularly.
Even cellularly, genetically, like memory can be constructed. Like, I think of, like, you know, Blade Runner. Like, we're getting into architecture on a Blade Runner level, like where, you know, we might be getting so immersive that, you know, we can't even tell where it's become artificial intelligence, and we just mistake it for being our intelligence, when in fact, you know, we could be entering into like ever more thorough forms of immersion that are totally constructed ideologically.
I mean, look, I mean, architecture has it's structures of dominion, right? So, like, I mean, I don't deny that, right? There's a big, I wouldn't say problem, but there's a big concern that one needs to think about every time one, you know, I mean, we're in this point where architecture is real estate, right? It ceases to be, I mean, for a lot of buildings, it is just how much money can we put into this privatized space, and how much money can it generate, right? What is the layout of this plan for it to be most profitable? And I mean, it's scary, you know, but it does, you know, it does build into these sort of literary and filmic references that, it's gonna.
I mean, these would also be the unquestioned kind of like parameters of like the architectural competition. Or,
I mean, part of the problem is that architecture has been reduced to its sign value, right? When it symbolizes what it represents, because 90% of the people are going to experience architecture through an image. They're not going to experience it. They're not going to know what it's looked like. I mean, one of the first questions I ask students is like, what's your favorite building? They name something, and I ask them, have you been there? And they say no, right? So I also think that's part of the problem. Is like architecture is completely through media, through representation, through the production of the profession, how we practice. It's 100%. It's sign value. Its use value has no. I mean, it doesn't even. I mean, you can win an architecture. They give a prize every year for the best building, and most of the jury doesn't even visit that building. You know, so it's the evaluation, it's the production, and this is where my critique comes down. Maybe the image as it relates to the physical. It's
Right.
almost irrelevant now if the building is actually spatially successful or useful. I mean, I worked on projects that won awards before they were even finished.
Yeah.
You know, so it's because the facade was up, so it looked finished.
I mean, you're right.
That's
I
why
got
we live.
invited.
That's why we live in the blue pill version of the Matrix, where it's like a shithole.
Yeah.
It's like because people live in these other headspace. It's like New York is getting worse and worse every day.
No, you're right.
So then, are you like I feel like in what you're saying, Julie, there's a kind of desire to take the red pill, and that the red pill is, you know, associated with a kind of, I don't know, like a
No, I'm saying, yeah, I'm saying
experience.
that the whole experience is kind of in everybody's heads. It's all like, it's not like the physical real, like this idea of being attached to the soil, what Lawrence was talking about, and being associated with place, and like being associated with a place, coming from that, eating from that, building from that, knowing the material of that, experiencing materiality and engaging with that. That's kind of completely consumed by this mitigated screen experience that we're talking about, where most of these people are studying to draw on these screens. They don't even draw with their hands. They don't know how to even do that. So they don't even think outside of this, and it becomes this whole kind of experience that's in the head that, to me, then you're in the panopticon. Like, that's it. Like, that's that space. Like, and you're constantly being observed, and everything is being mitigated through that. And that is the opposite of the physical sensual experience of the world. And there's a moment where yeah, you have to, like, I don't know. I feel like that's also like, I've been talking with Robin Cost-Lewis recently, this poet who we've been talking about, like, accessing places of, like, making. And she's been talking about this in terms of how to articulate certain things. And she, I was asking her some questions and aspects about, some of the questions and some of the conversations we've been having with Fred Moten about these ideas of, like, the fugitive and understanding, trying to kind of talk about how to invent something from a place where you're trying to be in this liberated space somehow conceptually. And we've been talking about intuition in that space. And she basically was saying, one of the biggest things with, like, so many activist projects and civil rights projects are the pontificators, the loud pontificators who want to stand up in the squares and tell you how fucked up things are, and she's talking about Black resistance and how there were always these women in the background doing this work. They were actually getting stuff done, and we're 10 steps ahead, the grandmothers, whatever. And that there's the arena, there's the stadium, there's the place where something has to be expressed in a particular way and told in a particular way. But it's like talking to after the show is finished, telling you that the world is fucked up. It's like, that is clear, that is evident, but there has to be, where's that space where that other construction is happening? Where is that? How does that happen? And how do you feel through that? And how do you come from this place where you're coming from Zimbabwe, where you have that experience of Harare? I lived in Harare a long, long time ago, but I have some kind of understanding of that. And Addis Ababa, where I was born and being raised in the US, and where we all come from, all of our crazy, like, backgrounds and our experiences, and this meta narrative that we bring to the table, and how do we physically interact in this space where there is a possibility to invent something else. And I don't want to, like, I feel like, I don't know what I'm saying, I'm kind of lost in it, but I know that there's a place where we can imagine and build differently, that's not about this idea of, like, having it be some enlightened kind of pedagogical space or enlightened kind of space that serves in the way that you're talking about, Paul, that's easily a colonial project in and of itself. But there is something that's possible from mining and excavating in this past, and that can construct something else. And I feel a need to insist on it, because otherwise our physical experiences are shit. And especially those that have less. It's shittier.
Well,
And
but see,
Addis Ababa is a prime example of that. Like the city, Addis Ababa is fucked because people want to erase everything that made it an interesting place. All the early Adobe homes it's the only indigenous city on the continent that actually has indigenous infrastructure as part of the city. And it's completely being erased as an example for this desire to build and to concrete and follow the grid that we have in the computer. And there's huge loss in that comes from an ancient knowledge, this place of slow observation, this place of kind of building differently. And I think that, you know, I don't know. I think that part of it is because kids don't build, they don't draw, they don't learn, there's not this place of like the material, which is part of like reclaiming. It's like how we think about the garden. It's reclaiming a certain kind of knowledge, or trying to, you know.
Right.
And
Well,
I think that,
I think it's not
go ahead, Lauren.
not just reclaiming, it's, you know, continuing to build on that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah. Maxwell, you were going to say something.
No, I mean, I think back to Julie's point about the speed, or the fact that people had nothing to do and they were slowed down in this moment, you know, and I think that also spoke to the mobilization, right, of the protest, because in a way, as fast as our communication has become, it's become so precious, right, within this time, that it's almost as if, you know, the mobilization that was done before, or even just to construct, took a lot of effort to send that information to somebody else, you know, to put that down on paper. And I mean, I think it kind of, for me, takes that, right? And so here, I mean, in many countries in Africa, the government will shut down the internet, right?
Right.
To quell protest, right? But people have these sort of modes of resistance, right? Ways of creating hidden transcripts, right? And I think it manifests within that space, right? To say, okay, you can't do what you want to do, like be in a big Facebook group, and once that's gone, it really does create a kind of a precious time that, okay, we've made the effort to communicate, we have to do something now. And I think within buildings as well, it's like, I mean, I have students who'll come and you tell them that building isn't right, they'll come back the next day and draw something completely different. And I was like, it wasn't bad, you could fix it. You know,
well, it's easier to start over than to...
Yeah, it's amazing. You're like, what is this building that you didn't have yesterday? You know, makes the other one work. And the resistance to going back and putting in that work is amazing for me. It's unbelievable. Because, you know, you could never just throw away a drawing. Like, just to buy that goddamn Mylar paper was an effort. You know, now it's not there. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't want to create, somehow if you hate digital representation, it almost makes it too important, right? Like, I do see value in it, because also it does allow for a certain, what I always had, my issue with architecture is always it's really biased to those who are able-bodied, right?
Oh.
I mean, if you're in a wheelchair, or if you have a hard time walking, or if you have any issues with your sort of appendages, it's really hard to practice architecture, right? So one thing that was nice in this last semester is like students who otherwise might not be able to sort of access a neoclassical building like Slocum Hall at Syracuse University can actually attend class. So I do think part of it's also on us as well. And also like we can't say it's bad because they're not drawing by hand. It's like, I understand the importance of it.
You make students code though. I think coding is
different.
Yeah.
Because that's
a language, right?
Right.
You can't go back and rewrite your code. You have to fix that sentence. You know what I mean? Because it's syntax.
Right. No, I mean, thanks. Now I can say that next time someone asks me why. So thank you. Right. No, because I think it's important to create our own tools. It's like, this is the language everything uses that we don't know it. Right. This is no different than someone reading books to us because we think it's not important to learn how to read. Right. So I agree. But I do think how do you teach the slowness of drawing? Because like one time I did this workshop in Ohrid, Macedonia with students. I had them hand draw figure grounds of different cities at the same scale. And doing this taught them scale. They understood what a residential building looks like, what a manufacturing building looks like. So they could identify it was that physical act of drawing. Whereas I taught them that in ArcGIS and they never would have learned that. So the challenge is how can we actually teach them that physicality? Because that's how you get that memory. So that I remember things like sketching something down, even if it's not what I heard, that act of the sketch puts it in my memory. Right? And I learn it. So how do we do that? And that's kind of the question, because I mean, we're not going to be able to get everyone to draw again, especially because most education will probably be online for a little while.
What you guys are saying really, kind of like clarifies for me what I was thinking about when Julie was talking about the experience of place. And that, for me, that the importance of visiting these buildings that I've been fortunate enough to like is not necessarily about a kind of like transcendent, awe-inspiring experience of like a cathedral or a temple, but really has to do with connecting with the labor that built these spaces, not just like the construction labor, but also the intellectual labor of like giving up these spaces, and that labor is kind of like the challenge is how do you read that labor? How does that labor become visible to you, like through materials, through the organization of space?
But I think sometimes it's the beauty in these banal buildings as well. Like it's like, okay, for this ranch we're staying at since mid-March, my partner's grandparents built it, right? It gets up to 95 degrees here, and we haven't once turned the air conditioning on.
Right, but this is also what where you're leading my thinking is that it's not just the connection with like labor as like an force that extracts value from nature, but as labor, as in like
labor of going there.
But no, but I mean like the labor of like connecting with the labor of like the labor of building these spaces is connecting with those physical bodies. It is like a real physical connection. And it's not like it's not like those bodies are in the past, right? But that I'm actually like a continuation of that body as well.
Exactly.
Ways this
I love that.
a kind of like a colonial and imperial understanding of history is something that like these are things that happened in the past. Like we're no longer in the time of slavery. Like everyone is free now, and we're free to like make our own decisions about like where we want to be in the world. No, like we're still connected in very tangible ways to that like historical reality that is not the past, in the same way that this building is the incontrovertible evidence of like like how the exploitation of labor to like produce these magnificent buildings.
It's true.
I just think that there's
and I don't want to try and put this out there that I'm just wanting magnificent buildings and that's all like that's not what I'm trying to.
No.
That's fair.
We understand.
I mean, shit. If the U.S. If the U.S. were as well designed as like the fucking Netherlands, like, okay, like, like, I'll do what you want me to do. Like, I'll clean like every now and then, but they can't even fucking give us that.
Well, I mean, for me, your turnstiles in the New York Metro are so violent in like that doubleness, and Barcelona's a bit like that. I remember the first time I got to Germany, I was so anxious about just getting to the train because there's nothing stopping you from getting to the train. You could just walk to the train. And it was very disconcerting to just, have that, you know, you're not assaulted, right? Like you can just be in the space and go to the train, and you're not being asked, you know.
You have to be able to recognize that. That's another issue, say, with the United States, and why New York is becoming maybe so horrendous, is because people don't know this alternative, or they don't appreciate the alternative. They don't even, a lot of people can't even recognize good space, right? They're happy with going to a really bad mall that's poorly ventilated, et cetera. I mean, I'm not trying to make a generalization, but your ability to recognize that as better, or as a quality of space, or as something that enables you to live a life that you want to live is also really, I mean, one thing, we teach architectural students to be architects, but we actually don't teach them how to understand space physically. Like how will they know when they go into a space why this makes them feel a certain way, right? Because of that lack of the barrier at the turnstile, because of these things, you feel more a participant in this environment. So it's one thing to also have the tools to curate and design and build these spaces, but also to know it when you're there, right? To articulate it. How do you, so many people don't say what they want to say because they can't articulate it. So they articulate it. I can't articulate, but then they default to what they know they can explain, right? So that inability of language to articulate why we feel, or that has to be part of the education as well. Because that's when you can tell people, like, hey, it's these turnstiles, gotta get rid of them because of this. And like, yeah, that's a good one, right? So I think that's not just making, but also understanding, appreciating, recognizing, and then articulating why these spaces and these places sort of make you feel a certain way.
Right. Well, that also comes under the heading, doesn't it, of like architecture as a vehicle for like critical engagement.
Or
or what?
mindful. I teach my students, how to meditate, like the first.
Right.
I mean,
that's a good example. I mean,
I lived in Helsinki for a while and I studied there, and then these 4 professors came to visit me when I was in grad school, and they wanted me to drive them to Kentucky to go to a bourbon factory and then look at Shaker furniture, right? And I mean, it was fun because they'd also, like, they'd understand that if you're not driving, you can't drink in a car, right? right. But they actually, I mean, they're showing you how to look at Shaker furniture. They took that time, that slowness. I had a class with this guy, Johanni Palasma. It was The Elements, before Rem ripped him off. But it was his experience with the elements throughout the course of his life. So it was like, an hour and a half of his own slides on stairs, right? And that slowness and him teaching us how to understand a stair more than just 7 inches up, 11 inches across, right? Or as a requirement for a space you make, but as a fundamental thing in of itself. And teaching us the language and showing a stair in India and how a stair, I mean, this is the sort of, I think, is far more important, because then you begin to recognize stairs. As you're walking, this kind of goes back to this Hegelian sort of idea of being in place, being where you are.
Totally.
I think this is really what we're all describing right now, is that we all know how to describe it, but how do we convey that to people so they don't want the billboard anymore,
Or so they don't want that building. What is that building called that looks like
the representation.
Yeah.
I mean,
no, I got you. But also that Hermes bag. Is it the Hermes bag?
Yeah.
The bag.
What is it called?
The gherkin?
Huh?
Yeah.
The gherkin?
No, not the Birkin bag.
Birkin.
No, the what's the shed called? The skin of the shed. What do they call that? They call that the Prada bag or the Hermes bag. It's named after a bag. People now refer to it as the bag. The name of it is one bag. It's the skin. It has that bubble material, like one of those.
Yeah. It's the one that Herzog Timmermann used in Tokyo for the Prada store. It's just it's kind of like
the Prada bag.
Yeah.
It's the shell of the shed in New York City. You know what I'm
right.
talking about?
Awful. Right. It's ETFE is the material.
Yeah. I didn't know it had a moniker.
If you can refer to the skin of a building as a Hermes bag or a Prada bag or whatever the bag was, that's the country that has President Trump as president. That's to me, like, all of that is like, that's what I'm trying to, like, it's all interrelated. Like that whole area of the Hudson Yards, or that whole area that's being developed now across from the Whitney, that park. I'm only speaking because that's the area that I experienced.
No, but it's really horrible. It's
really horrible, and it's an enormous amount of money that went into building those things.
But as you said before, it's successful for the people that constructed this thing. They all made so much money, so it is spatially, urbanistically, and really in every way possible a failure, but it did exactly what it was designed to do for certain people. Right. And that's the problem. I think that's what we're talking about, this country we live in. And in reducing things to sign values, and a real estate agent makes more than an architect on a commission for a building, right? So all these things are playing together. So they care more about the person that's going to sell the building, and that's actually going to make the building, right? Because that's the value. That's where
Paul,
you make
yeah,
the money.
yeah, I hear you.
What's that?
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
So
No,
I mean,
I hear you.
Hudson Yards is. I mean, it's effective in its colossal failure. It's almost impressive in how it fails at every level.
Right.
Like it's not even good
It
looking.
does.
Like so.
But it's
Well, Paul, what were you
it's
thinking about it?
well, it's just that
Because I feel you're resisting it a little bit, and I want to understand that.
my only resistance is that I feel like in some ways I just have I question a kind of like the degree to which we point to a problem and then pose a kind of like almost like imaginative solution to it that entails a kind of romantic view of going back to the past.
No, well,
And
look at Zaha Hadid. She's right there. That's not of the past. That is right there.
So, but in a sense, yeah, like
Or look at Zaha Hadid's airport in that city in China. Where's the new airport?
Chengdu? No.
Yeah.
I think so. Enormous. It looks like this.
Yeah.
and that to me is like that's a type of like relationship encoded in architecture that wouldn't have been possible without the digital. So that in a sense, like,
Oh yeah.
Well,
like there's
Nervi was doing this stuff in the 20th century but he was just
sure.
pure Nervi, but he was a pure genius. We can't rely on that.
But I mean, for me,
I'm not, but my criticism wasn't like what I want to understand was I'm not criticizing the digital completely. I'm only asking about if everything becomes about this conceptual like discourse that undermines and is critical of the actual built and physical experience, then that thing fails itself. It will continue to fail and get worse and worse. And what I'm saying is there has to be some insistence on that space as much of like for that experiential. And but I'm saying like I'm not trying to live in some fantasy where Trump isn't president and those kinds of buildings aren't desired. But at like right there north by Hudson Yards is that Zaha Hadid building, which I feel is way more successful because of the way that it was designed and the way that she thinks of that physical. There's this experience. There's this other aspect to this fundamental thing of being in the space and experiencing that. And
But
I don't know what I'm trying to get. I'm just trying to bring that back.
I mean, all I'm trying to say is that, like, just to go back to one thing that I heard is like there's this association between like a kind of architectural experience that becomes filmic.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes,
that to
cinematic,
me, like really, or cinematic, like that is basically, that speaks of immersion, and that like immersion relates to screens. Like to me, I just don't think that there's any going back. And that to me, like the problem with the problem with Trump as president has more to do with a kind of like lack of proficiency with the conditions of our time, rather than a critique of like the conditions themselves per se. Like in some ways, I feel like we see like, the more we get into like the proliferation of like of the digital, to just for lack of a better word, I think we're seeing more and more like successful examples of where the digital merges with the physical, as in Zaha Hadid's work, or as in like, the African American, legacy museum in DC, or many other examples. And that really like this kind of like sense of everybody being stuck on like the worst kind of junk food version of shit that's being put out there. Like say like the news cycle has to do with like, our kind of like lack of a kind of resistance to being like sucked into like the bullshit. And so that to me, like the way forward has something to do with like becoming more proficient with these new languages that are emerging, these hybrid like forms that are emerging, so that we can begin to like make better decisions about what we fucking consume.
I agree.
Look,
I agree.
I used to be a
100%.
complete Luddite, but I mean, there is some magic within the digital space, and especially I mean, just the battle of trying to code something, right? And I only know like a, a minuscule amount of C# coding, but just that conversation you have with yourself and with the program, trying to make it work is an experience that is awful, but it's important. And I think new things are definitely coming out of it, right?
I'm sorry to cut you off, but Mitesh has to cut out. I just wanted to.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I have to give this lecture in 15 minutes. I got to change my.
You're actually giving a lecture.
So this is
That's
wonderful. So I'd like to
Sorry.
continue this if somehow, or just find. I'm probably. I don't know what happens next, but hopefully there is a next. Thank you all for inviting me. I'm sorry I had to go. I'm sorry I was in transport during the whole time.
That was great.
That was fascinating.
Added some
It's like going
excitement
to
to it.
Disneyland and it rains. It's like a better experience.
All right, it was really wonderful. I'm sure we'll all keep this up. And Maxwell, great to meet you.
Mitesh, we'll get
Bye.
some of your books and information from Lawrence. We can get that.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, and good
Thank
luck.
you.
And talk to everyone. Hopefully, it's again soon. All right, bye.
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 Hi.
Bye.
Sorry, Max, you were saying.
I don't even remember. I just started to think of how prolific Miitesh is. Like he just produces a lot of stuff. It's scary for me, but it's
You
lovely.
say prolific, prolific too.
I don't know. I mean, like, and he's organized. I don't think I'm that organized. It's quite amazing. Yeah, but no. Look,
Let's see about it after Oxford.
I don't know.
What are you studying? What are you going to study at Oxford?
Yeah, actually, I am doing something. Well, I actually want to go there because they have this amazing new center called the Oxford Internet Institute, but I was never going to get in there. And part of like my Machiavellian plan, the reason I'm doing the lecture tomorrow is one of the professors from that school is in the lineup. So, you know, I'm slowly inceptioning myself into his orbit. I'm doing sustainable urban development just because I get to everything from the city. So I'm scared at how they're going to teach it, but because they don't have a school of architecture or design, but they have one of these big development centers, right? Like Sheffield, Manchester, they love development. It's like the new thing. Even the Bartlett is turning into a center of development. Forget architecture. It's all about disaster capitalism. So I wasn't going to do development because that's not for me. But so I thought, yeah, sustainable urban development, you know, around cities and city making, I can blag it. But my thesis actually is on platform urbanism and
What does that mean?
as in Uber, anything that you use through an app, right? And the relationship between those services and the city. So like there's a difference between that and smart urbanism. I still don't know what smart urbanism is. I think it's just a thing people say in city governments to sound like they're, you know, making a difference. But there's a difference, right? That's more about the data analytics. It's more about how Google can tell you when the train is coming, right? Whereas platform urbanism is really about, yeah. So that's it. So that's, I mean, look, I'm very interested also just because of how it's affecting this part of the world. So my thesis is all about how the digital spaces are changing African cities at a time when they are changing rapidly themselves, right? And how it is actually sort of this reproduction of capitalism. And because a lot of organizations, the UNs, the national and local governments see these as opportunities to make life more equal, but it's not, you know? It's still creating the problems that we know and live with.
You mean the apps?
The apps, yeah. You know, I mean, and especially now people are understanding what it means to work on a screen, you know, what it means to work in like with a 0-hour contract, right? And this is more luxurious because, you know, most people are working from home on a laptop. but when your whole like economy is on a screen, right? The other side of Uber or the other side of these delivery apps, the other side of Amazon Prime is is predicated on people working at a speed that is not human, right? So it's this it's like, how do you get past this dehumanized nature? And I think
Right.
the problem with all of this, the problem with architecture, for me, I mean, it really comes down to like policy level, right? Because I
Mm.
mean, in the UK, nobody loves the planning that goes on there. But I imagine like the Scandinavian countries, or I mean, they're just, I wouldn't say they're permissive, but they have a different understanding of what it means to be able to create a space, right? Whereas in the UK, you have to have a certain kind of handrail at a certain kind of height, a certain thickness that you can hold on to, or it's not considered
Up to
regulations.
code. Yeah.
Exactly, right? You can't have those slender, kind of flat uh, rails. I mean, it just doesn't work. So yeah, so that's what I'm going towards, to say, what does it mean to look at these spaces and actually through a quantitative and qualitative analysis that uses architectural techniques, right? And I mean, we're at that space now where people are more open to this idea that there's a there's a rigor to artistic practice and study, right? That can be translated into something that can influence not just like a degree or a doctorate, but something that can be applied beyond. I think of forensic architecture, right? Who
Mm.
do a lot of great work uh, investigating atrocities, or
Right.
Lawrence Abdulhamid. It's artistic, but it's rigorous,
Yeah.
and you know
And
it
it's
holds
research
up.
based.
Exactly. So that's what I want to do, and obviously they're not set up for it, but like I said, I've been explicit.
They're
you know
not?
I mean, Oxford has an art school, which is the Ruskin, but it's the Ruskin. It's okay, but it's
Sure.
not. Don't go there unless you want to go to Oxford, kind of thing. It's good, but go to London schools if you're crazy about that. I don't think it's going to be set up for me to work across the Ruskin, the Oxford Internet Institute, and whatever other development school is there. I mean, nobody does that, right? So it's this idea to say, and also within this idea of decolonizing the practice, is to say the way it's been set up is too restrictive, right? Like architecture is too restrictive. Like it should be opened up to allow other disciplines. And yeah, there's something within like the geographers, right? Because they allow themselves to cut across spaces. That I'm look, I'm gonna try it.
But you
If
know
it
what? I
doesn't
gotta
work,
say though, like, Julie, like you brought up the term fugitive,
yeah,
and my understanding, I mean, it's funny to hear you say that, like, in a way, like there's an investment in a way changing or updating regulations, because my understanding of like the fugitive is almost not the opposite, but it's just like a different sensibility. It's kind of like, it's more pragmatic. It's like accepting the limits of, like, say, the institution, and then recognizing precisely the kind of like informal agency that one can have,
yeah,
unannounced, unregulated, just quietly, like you conduct your revolution, like you decide that you're going to work interdisciplinarily, without the structure actually changing it, or
I
without the
mean,
structure changing to be more accepting of it. It's
but
like,
you do need them to be compliant. There has to be some kind of complicity, right? Somewhere with someone at least. And I don't
right,
know who that is, right? So I
you
mean,
will
if I
find
wanted
them.
yeah, if
You
I
will.
wanted
You
to
will
do this
find
at
them.
an institution I knew, if I went back to the Bartlett, I know, and I know people who've created and charted their own course. But I think that's also what it takes for our cities and our spaces, especially like African governments, right? You speak to Addis, everyone is so enthralled in this idea of what a city should be, right?
Hmm.
Um, Everyone wants to get to, like, I don't know where they want to go. Dubai, I don't know, or China, that just
Hmm.
came from nowhere.
That's exactly what Addis wants.
You know, exactly. They don't want to put in the work of finding out, well, what does it mean to create a new Addis? What is
Right.
Addis? You know, what can it be?
Exactly.
They
On
just need
its
to like
own.
dig for oil.
Yeah, of itself. You know, yeah.
Wipe out
it is.
everything and just dig for oil.
Yeah.
And pray.
So, I mean,
while they send tulips to the Netherlands.
yeah. I don't know. I mean, it should be interesting. Where is everyone, by the way? Is everyone in New York or not?
I'm sorry, Maxwell. This was really great. I have to take off. I have these two
Yeah, no,
kids, and
good.
I have
That's
to
why I'm
take
asking.
Addis somewhere. So
Ju-
I'm
Ju-
upstate. I'm at Denniston Hill.
Denniston
Oh,
Hill is in the.
so
Di-
jealous.
You're in the dining
Say
room.
that?
You're in the dining.
Yeah.
room. Yeah.
Yeah.
Paul is in New York
Lovely.
City, East Harlem, and I'm in Syracuse.
Okay. Thanks for this, Lawrence. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Maxwell.
Yeah, Lawrence, thank you so much for organizing this. Thank
Yeah,
you,
thanks,
Maxwell.
Lawrence.
And thanks for letting us participate. This was great.
Super fun conversation.
Was
Have fun.
and Maxwell will
It was to be continued.
yeah. When does
Definitely.
Oxford will begin in the fall for you, or?
Yeah,
Bye,
it's the
guys.
fall. Oh, and they're very determined to get people at the
Bye,
school.
Joe.
Yeah.
Huh.
They are sending emails saying we are opening, we are starting. I mean,
Wow.
remember the prime minister went there, so I bet you they can do whatever they want, right? So yeah, it's so weird because
How do you feel about that?
Cambridge is the complete opposite. Cambridge has sort of said we're going online, you know, but yeah.
Like, do you have your ticket already? Are you like?
No, I don't have my ticket. Actually, a part of my kind of agenda is also I signed up for well, I didn't sign up. I got offered a fellowship at Académie Scole Solitude, so I'll be in Germany and then only going to Oxford every 6 weeks.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so that's what I'm more excited about. Like,
Yeah.
you know.
Me too. I'd be much more excited about living in Germany than
Yeah. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to that, and it's all October, so you know, can't wait.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks. By the way, gentlemen, you are winning with the Corona hair. It's amazing. That's great. I'm being sincere. I know it's hard to tell.
A haircut.